Oh, drone. Drone is here. Oops. They hit crane.
Putin painted a picture of horror, but the response he received was much more terrifying, much faster, and much more humiliating. Putin launched a ruthless attack on Kyiv on November 13th. Within hours, on the night of November 14th, Ukrainian missiles turned the port of Novorossiysk into a hellish scene. The scale of this attack was so colossal and catastrophic that the Russian governor was forced to declare a state of emergency in the city. Turkish sailors at the port recorded those hellish moments that lit up the night.
It's been going on for an hour. They hit the refinery. They hit the ship. They hit the refinery again.
Comments on social media were clear. Very beautiful. The S-400 systems protecting the port, the warehouses in the port, the petrol stations, and the piers were destroyed. Ukraine had leveled them with a combination of Neptune missiles with a range of 1,000 kilometers and drones. And confirmation came from the highest level, directly from Zelensky. This was the first major strike by Ukraine's indigenous pride, the 1,000-kilometer range long Neptune cruise missiles. The Russians were blindly relying on the 12 S-400 Triumph launchers they had piled up at the port. On the night of November 14th, the first wave of the Ukrainian attack targeted not the port itself, but its eyes and shield protecting it. As confirmed by President Zelensky himself, domestically produced long Neptune cruise missiles with a range of 1,000 kilometers were launched. The target? The invincible S-300 and S-400 batteries belonging to the 1,537th Kuban Air Defense Missile Regiment. Now, take a good look at these images. Air defense systems are in panic mode, firing into the sky without knowing what they're hitting. And immediately after, silence and a massive secondary explosion. The shield had fallen. Remember that hellish scene recorded by Turkish sailors? Those very nice comments were about more than just a burning oil terminal. What they witnessed was the helpless burning of 12 S-400 launchers belonging to the 1,537th Anti-Aircraft Missile Regiment. The Russians had blindly trusted the 12 S-400 Triumph launchers they had piled up at the port. However, the SBU Alpha unit set up a brilliant combined trap. First, kamikaze UAVs like FP-1 and FP-2 were sent ahead as bait. The goal was not to hit the launchers, but to force the expensive S-400 radars to light up, confuse them, and keep them busy. While Russian air defense operators were locked onto these cheap targets, the real deadly blow came from the low-flying, highly maneuverable, long Neptune missiles. The moment the shield fell, the second phase of the operation began. The Russian Ministry of Defense issued a statement saying, "We shot down 66 UAVs in the Krasnodar region." Perhaps that is true, but this does not change the fact that the main force has reached its target. They have now turned their attention to the defenseless economic heartland. Primary target, the Sheshkaris oil terminal, owned by the Russian state-owned monopoly Transneft. Tank farms, critical pumping facilities, and loading docks where giant tankers docked were hit one by one. Hours after the attack, the Russian state monopoly Transneft was forced to make an official statement. All operations at the Novorossiysk port have been suspended. Do you know what this means? It means that 1/5, 20%, of Russia's seaborne oil exports came to a halt overnight. It means a 2% disruption in global oil supply. As soon as news of the attack broke, global Brent oil prices immediately jumped by 2% to 3%. Putin needed this oil to cover the costs of the war he started in Ukraine. Now that oil is burning in his own port. This means that the flow of money into the war chest has been cut off overnight. As we mentioned earlier, that revenge fire in Novorossiysk didn't just hit Russian oil. Putin's incompetence also hit his ally, Kazakhstan. The attack also temporarily shut down the Caspian Pipeline Consortium, CPC terminal, which is right next door. Putin has now become an unreliable partner who can no longer protect his allies, and is even holding their economies hostage for his own war. And right then, another blow came from the east. Japan announced harsh sanctions, synchronized with Ukraine, against the shadow fleet Russia uses to smuggle oil from ports like Novorossiysk. This is a nightmare scenario for Putin. While Ukraine physically destroys Putin's oil bridge in Novorossiysk, economic giants like Japan are legally sinking the shadow fleet tankers Russia uses to bypass that bridge. Putin has become such a risky partner that even buyers like China are forced to increase imports from Saudi Arabia to fill the gap in Russian oil. But there is a more painful aspect to this event than its economic dimension: the human aspect. The cornerstone of Putin's propaganda was the promise of stability and security. On the night of November 14th, this contract exploded in the faces of the people of Novorossiysk, the untouchable port city where the fleeing Crimean fleet took refuge and Russian elites vacationed, turned into a war zone overnight. The panic was so great that Governor Veniamin Kondratiev was unable to control the situation and was forced to officially declare a state of emergency in the city. The war was on Russia's doorstep. According to official figures, at least 4 apartment blocks and 2 private homes were damaged. Crew members on a civilian ship in the port were injured. And now, we come to the clearest photo of the betrayal. Military Unit number 52,522. OSINT sources have confirmed that this is a huge ammunition depot. So where is this depot? Right in the middle of civilian settlements, schools, and apartment buildings. When this depot exploded, the fireball that emerged showed the whole world how Putin has put his own people in danger, how he has used them as human shields. The Russian people are paying the price for Putin's war, both with their empty wallets and now with their lives. Putin is not protecting the Russian people. Putin is throwing the Russian people into the fire for his own power. That night, Putin also hit his own ally. Kazakhstan's oil export route, which used that port, was cut off due to Russia's incompetence. And while all this was happening, Putin was losing on another front. Just a few days earlier, his economic partner Japan had announced new and critical sanctions against that shadow fleet that enabled Russia's oil smuggling. This attack on Novorossiysk, this military embarrassment and economic loss, plunged the Kremlin into complete panic. Because this attack showed how fragile Putin's strategic impasse is. They are not only losing on the outside, on the front lines. Internally, they cannot even protect their most valuable assets with the invincible S-400s. And this situation triggered the Kremlin's greatest fear. They have run out of soldiers. There is no manpower left. This total mobilization panic of the Kremlin is precisely a product of this strategic impasse. Ukraine's increasingly successful attacks on critical points such as the port of Novorossiysk and Russian refineries forced Putin into an impossible choice. He had to divert valuable units from his already inadequate army to protect these strategic facilities, to protect the refineries. This move, combined with massive losses on the front lines, has turned the manpower shortage in the Russian army from a crisis into a catastrophe. Putin desperately needs a new mass mobilization to fill the gaps on the front lines and protect domestic facilities. However, he has not forgotten the great embarrassment of 2022, when he declared a partial mobilization, which resulted in the flight of more than 260,000 educated men, brain drain, from the country. This time, he could not allow the same game of insecurity. Therefore, to prevent mass flight, he has now resorted to digitally blocking the exit of everyone summoned from the borders, using the Gosuslugi portal and FSB databases. This is no longer a brain drain. It is a much more dangerous brain lockdown, because qualified engineers and workers who cannot escape will choose to hide rather than go to the front, crippling the Russian war economy from within. By closing the escape route, Putin has lit the fuse for a social explosion. And when even this brain lockdown proved insufficient, Putin resorted to an even more pitiful plan. Let's recall, just a few weeks ago, Putin announced a brilliant plan to counter Ukraine's attacks on refineries. What was that plan? Protecting refineries with reserve soldiers and veterans. This was already a comedy. On the night of November 14th, we saw that while Ukraine was targeting S-400s with long Neptune missiles from 1,000 kilometers away, would Putin deploy 60-year-old veterans against this technology? Putin's crisis is not just about manpower. The real crisis is in fuel, the lifeblood of war. The destruction of that massive oil terminal in Novorossiysk was a dagger thrust into Russia's already bleeding fuel wound. Ukraine's year-long campaign of refinery attacks had already plunged Russia's domestic fuel market into chaos. Putin's energy superpower could no longer find gasoline for its own cars, its own tanks, or even its own farmers. And this desperation forced them to knock on the door of their last ally, Belarus. Amid this chaos, Belarus entered the equation. According to data verified by industry sources, Belarus exported a full 49,000 tons of gasoline and 33,000 tons of diesel fuel to its neighbor in September. These figures represent an explosion compared to previous months. However, the shockwave created by these figures pales in comparison to Russia's massive consumption figures. Russia consumes more than 3 million tons of gasoline in a normal month. In other words, the 49,000-ton rescue package from Belarus covers only 1.6% of the country's monthly needs. This is like offering a band-aid to a patient who is bleeding profusely. While reserves in large cities such as Moscow and St. Petersburg may suffice for a while, the crisis began to spiral out of control across the vast geography stretching from the eastern Urals to Siberia, and from the southern agricultural regions to the Far East. The Kremlin initially found a solution in completely banning gasoline exports. This was an unprecedented panic move, meaning giving up foreign exchange revenues vital to the war budget. But even this was not enough to stop the internal bleeding. Prices skyrocketed, a black market emerged, and eventually, regional administrations were forced to resort to desperate measures reminiscent of the Soviet era, such as sales restrictions and price freezes. Tankers from Belarus were entering Russian territory, the most tangible evidence of this major failure, this systematic collapse. But even this did not solve Russia's oil crisis. Another chapter in this total systemic collapse was written in flames and twisted metal on September 25, 2025, near Smolensk, the country's western gateway. That day, the Last Hope train, carrying millions of liters of gasoline to alleviate Moscow's fuel shortage, collided with a truck at a simple level crossing and turned into a giant fireball. This disaster was not just the loss of 12 tanker cars and their precious cargo. It was a shameful testament to an energy superpower's inability to perform even the most basic logistical functions in a crisis, to its crumbling infrastructure, and to its war machine's inability to even sustain itself. The Russian state media's attempt to portray the incident as a simple accident cannot hide the truth. During wartime, the lack of even the most basic security measures on the Minsk-Smolensk-Moscow railway line, which is of such strategic importance, was a critical failure. This accident shut down the main railway line between Belarus and Russia for hours, halting not only fuel shipments, but also all military and civilian supplies passing through that line. Furthermore, this accident painfully demonstrated how fragile Russia's western logistics corridor is, and how a future accident or partisan sabotage could paralyze its entire frontline supply capacity. Putin's last hope had vanished on a broken level crossing, and what burned in Smolensk that night was not just a train, but the Kremlin's very own "everything is under control" propaganda. The strategic shock created by the tens of thousands of tons of gasoline arriving from Belarus is much greater than its volume. These shipments are not just a logistical emergency response, but also the most visible symptom of deepening cracks within Russia's home front that can no longer be hidden. The ripple effect of this crisis hits the Kremlin's most feared place, namely the daily life of ordinary Russian citizens, their patience, and their tacit allegiance to the regime. Putin's 20-year social contract with the Russian people has always been based on a simple equation. Hand over politics to me, and I will give you order, stability, and a predictable standard of living. The fuel crisis is tearing up this contract before the eyes of millions. That stability is now evaporating in miles-long queues at gas stations. That order is being destroyed by the anger of drivers fighting each other to get fuel, black marketeers demanding exorbitant prices per gallon, and farmers staring at empty shelves. The first and most devastating place to be hit by this ripple effect was Russia's agricultural sector. The crisis erupted at the most critical time of the harvest season. From Krasnodar to Rostov, in the southern regions known as the country's breadbasket, farmers could no longer find diesel to run their tractors and harvesters. This is not just an agricultural crisis, but the beginning of a potential food security disaster. Wheat that cannot be harvested from the fields will be reflected in bread prices in the coming months, while vegetables and fruits that cannot be transported will cause market shelves in large cities to remain empty. This is the most concrete example of how logistical paralysis can turn into a wave of domestic scarcity and chaos. Second, the crisis has trapped the Kremlin in an impossible dilemma. Military analysts have begun asking the question currently being debated at the General Staff headquarters in Moscow. Where will the scarce fuel go? To the massive diesel reserves needed to keep the tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery units on the Ukrainian front moving, or to the gas stations in the cities to prevent civil panic and a potential social explosion? If fuel is directed to the army, chaos in cities will escalate, and Putin's authority will be directly questioned by his own people. If fuel is diverted to civilian consumption, this will severely limit the mobility of Russian troops on the front lines, turning them into static and vulnerable targets and offering Ukraine new opportunities for attack. Both options carry the potential for disaster. This demonstrates how sophisticated Ukraine's strategy is. They are not just hitting a refinery, they are also forcing the Kremlin to make a terrible choice between its own people and its own army. The war has now returned to Russia's home, to Russia's safest harbor, leaving Putin nowhere to run. This is the fall of Putin's oil fortress, and it is merely a harbinger of a greater collapse. So, what are your thoughts on this matter? Could the fact that Putin's most trusted hawks have turned against him bring this war to an end? Please share your thoughts in the comments. To stay updated on new videos, please subscribe to our channel and remember to turn on notifications. Thank you for choosing us.